The sun hung low over Oak Hollow Estates the day Martin and Julia finally pulled into their new driveway. The sky a quiet gold that should have promised peace, but instead hovered ominously over a neighborhood that looked perfect on the outside and rotten just beneath. From the moment the moving truck turned the corner, a set of eyes watched them from behind the curtained window of a brick house across the street, unblinking and judging. Julia had already read a few strange comments in the neighborhood Facebook group after they'd introduced themselves, a few too curious questions about whether they'd be renters or owners, what their last names were, and whether they had children. But nothing quite prepared her for the woman who approached them not 20 minutes after the first box was carried inside. She wore a tight blue sweater, khaki slacks, and a smug expression that had clearly been practiced in the mirror. "I'm Karen, HOA President," she announced before either of them could say hello. Her eyes locked on the moving truck, then darted to the American flag Martin had leaned against the garage wall. "That flag will need to be registered," she said flatly. Martin raised an eyebrow. "Registered?" he repeated, as if the word had been plucked from an entirely different language. "Yes," Karen snapped. "All visible political or national symbols need to be approved for harmony compliance." Julia glanced at Martin, expecting him to laugh, but he didn't. His years in military service had taught him how to recognize a threat disguised in polite language. This wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. "Thanks for stopping by," he said calmly, and turned back toward the house, but Karen lingered. "There's also a 2-vehicle maximum in the driveway," she added, loud enough for neighbors to hear. "Overnight guests must register online, and I'll need your pet records if you have any animals." Julia stepped forward, her tone polite but firm. "We're homeowners, not tenants, and we'll read the bylaws ourselves." "Thank you." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. "I enforce the bylaws," she said, then turned and walked away, heels clicking sharply against the driveway, like a judge leaving a courtroom. Julia stood frozen for a second, then looked at Martin. "What the hell kind of neighborhood did we just move into?" He didn't answer. He was already scanning the street. 3 other homes had people standing behind their screen doors, pretending not to stare. From that day forward, it became clear that Karen didn't simply lead the HOA, she ruled it. Every rule was interpreted through her eyes, every decision passed through her mouth, and every challenge met with swift and calculated resistance. Within the first week, the couple received 3 citations, one for excessive lighting due to their porch light staying on past 11 p.m., another for improper garden decor because Julia's ceramic fox planter wasn't HOA approved, and a third for trash container visibility, even though theirs had been placed at the curb precisely within the posted window. Martin knew this wasn't incompetence. It was targeted. He began documenting everything, snapping photos, saving every notice, and quietly asking neighbors about their own experiences. Some shrugged and stayed quiet, but others whispered stories that sent shivers down Julia's spine. An elderly woman had been fined repeatedly for having wind chimes that were too loud. A single father had been reported to Child Protective Services because his son played basketball in the driveway after dark. A woman who once volunteered to run a block party was blacklisted from community events after questioning a budget line item. Karen's pattern was obvious: silence, dissent through paperwork, fear, and isolation. But Martin had faced worse during his deployments. He wasn't going to be pushed out of his own home by a woman with a clipboard and an ego the size of a battleship. So, he pushed back, quietly at first, filing formal disputes with the HOA board, asking for meeting minutes, requesting clarification on vague citations. The responses were either delayed or denied. That's when he realized the board wasn't a group of elected neighbors. It was a puppet show, and Karen held every string. She had rewritten procedures to make elections nearly impossible without her hand-picked candidates, raised the quorum threshold, and reduced meeting notices to less than 48 hours, ensuring almost no one could participate. But what she didn't know was that Julia had begun recording every interaction. She also didn't know that Martin, retired though he was, had spent the last 2 years consulting on civil liability cases and knew exactly what legal overreach looked like. They weren't just going to survive Karen, they were going to expose her. What began as a frustrating move-in day was already unfolding into a full-blown neighborhood showdown, and Martin was just getting started. The first real crack in Karen's polished facade came when Julia posted anonymously in a neighborhood app asking if anyone else had experienced unfair treatment from the HOA, and within hours her inbox was flooded with private messages, some hesitant, some frightened, and a few downright furious, each telling their own version of how Karen had turned Oak Hollow from a peaceful community into a place where people felt like they were living under surveillance. One woman shared how she was fined for letting her child's inflatable pool sit on the lawn for 2 days. Another said Karen had reported her home for suspicious activity because her husband worked nights and often came and went during off hours. But one message stood out more than the others. It came from a man named Ellis, who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 15 years and had once served briefly on the HOA board. She threatened to sue me when I disagreed with her budget report, he wrote. Said I was trying to sabotage community trust. I resigned. You won't find my name on anything official. She made sure of that. Julia showed the message to Martin, and they both realized that Karen's power wasn't rooted in legal authority. It was rooted in fear and the illusion of process. The bylaws, as written, were vague enough to be twisted, and she knew no one would risk legal fees or public fights to stop her. But that's exactly what Martin was preparing to do. He didn't want to go public yet, not until he had airtight evidence. So he started attending every meeting, quiet in the back row, notebook in hand, observing how Karen controlled the agenda, interrupted dissenters, and railroaded anyone who asked questions. Claire, one of the remaining board members, seemed sympathetic but hesitant. After one meeting, Martin approached her in the parking lot and asked, "Do you really agree with all of this?" She looked around before responding. Number. But I've seen what she does to people who speak up. My neighbor got audited over a misplaced potted plant. I'm not ready to be her next target. It wasn't courage, but it was honesty, and that gave Martin another angle. He began compiling a timeline, a visual map of citations, board changes, special sessions, and resident incidents, all pointing to the same thing, a systematic abuse of HOA authority for personal control. Julia, meanwhile, took a different approach. She began walking their dog at the same time every evening and started casually chatting with neighbors. She smiled, listened, and made people feel heard. And little by little, residents began opening up. They'd meet her on the sidewalk or text her later, always with the same tone. Please don't mention my name, but... What emerged was a picture of a community not angry, but exhausted, People who had stopped decorating their porches because Karen disapproved, who had altered their landscaping to avoid confrontation, who had considered moving just to escape her reach. Martin and Julia knew they couldn't fight this alone, so they started inviting neighbors over under the guise of casual barbecues. Once inside, Martin would pull out his laptop and quietly ask, "Have you ever received one of these?" showing a scanned copy of a violation notice. The reactions were immediate. Yes, that exact wording. Mine looked just like that too. I thought it was just me. Over the next few weeks, they built a coalition, not of rebels, but of ordinary homeowners who had simply had enough. Karen must have sensed something because the notices increased. Julia received 3 in 1 week, one for improper hose storage, one for non-compliant exterior ornament, and one that simply read, "Potential guest policy violation under review." That last one made Martin snap. He responded with a formal letter demanding a clear citation of the bylaw in question and a breakdown of how it was being applied. The HOA responded with a vague, 1-paragraph reply that didn't answer a single question. That was all he needed. He contacted a friend, an attorney who specialized in civil code violations and homeowners' rights, and asked him to review the documentation. The verdict came back swift and confident. She's overstepping her authority on almost every level. With that legal opinion in hand, Martin drafted a formal complaint to the state HOA regulatory office and submitted it under the names of 12 households willing to sign on. They also submitted a petition for an emergency meeting to request Karen's removal from the board. By this point, whispers were spreading across the neighborhood. Claire resigned from the board quietly, citing family health matters, though she messaged Julia privately to say, "Thank you for standing up. I hope something changes." Karen retaliated the only way she knew how, by escalating. She began walking the neighborhood more frequently, taking photos of yards, noting license plates, and hovering near driveways. Neighbors reported her lurking near windows, standing at the edge of properties, and writing in her notebook. One man who had just installed new garden lighting found Karen in his front yard measuring the distance between his fixtures and the sidewalk. She claimed she was inspecting for glare pollution. He told her to leave. She fined him $300. The final straw came when Julia received a hand-delivered citation placed directly into her palm while she was gardening for unauthorized soil composition. Martin read the citation twice, then scanned it and sent it straight to the attorney, adding, "Let's take this public." The next day, Julia posted the citation online with a simple caption, "This is what our HOA thinks is important." The post went viral. Dozens of neighbors commented. Some laughed. Others shared similar photos. Within 48 hours, a local news outlet reached out for an interview. Karen was no longer just annoying. She was exposed. The news crew arrived on a sunny Wednesday morning, their van pulling into the neighborhood with cameras already rolling. And by the time the reporter knocked on Martin and Julia's door, half the street was peeking from behind their curtains, unsure whether to cheer, hide, or brace for retaliation. Julia answered the door with a calm smile, while Martin stood behind her, holding a binder filled with documented violations, letters, timestamps, and photos. The interview took place on the porch. Martin, ever the professional, didn't rant or accuse, he explained. He described how the HOA under Karen had gradually twisted its authority into a tool of intimidation, how residents had received hundreds of dollars in unjustified fines, how some had stopped decorating their homes or letting children play in the front yard to avoid being cited. He handed the reporter copies of specific citations, redacted names of other neighbors who weren't ready to go public, and included screenshots of vague bylaws being weaponized against ordinary activity like hanging a flag or using decorative solar lights. Julia added a personal account, sharing how the emotional toll of constant surveillance and threats had affected their day-to-day life. "We moved here for peace," she said. "But what we found was something closer to quiet control, like everyone's smiling through their teeth." The story aired 2 days later, and it lit a match under the entire county. The headline was simple but effective: HOA or harassment. Neighborhood president under fire. Karen refused to be interviewed, but when the cameras knocked on her door, she did answer. And in true Karen fashion, she gave the reporter a cold, controlled statement about how some residents simply don't understand the value of order and how compliance is not optional. That line alone turned public opinion against her overnight. Comments flooded the station's social media pages. Former HOA members from other neighborhoods weighed in. Lawyers offered free consultations, and people from across the state began sharing their own Karen horror stories. But nothing mattered more than what happened inside Oak Hollow itself. The residents, many of whom had remained silent for years, were now emboldened. People began walking over to Martin and Julia's house with their own documents, their own letters, some decades old, some recent, all bearing the same tone of aggressive enforcement and veiled threats. Martin created a master file and started organizing group meetings, not protests, but planning sessions. They met in garages, backyards, even one family's basement, anywhere Karen couldn't show up with her camera or clipboard. The coalition grew. By the end of the month, over 40 households had signed the formal petition demanding Karen's removal, and the board, now consisting only of Karen and 2 hand-picked loyalists, was under immense pressure. The emergency meeting was set for the following Tuesday night to be held in the HOA clubhouse. Karen posted an announcement filled with warnings about disorderly conduct and even had signs taped around the neighborhood reminding residents of proper decorum. But the threat was empty. When the night came, nearly the entire community showed up. Families, veterans, young couples, retirees. Some carried notebooks, some carried nothing but their voices. Karen tried to begin the meeting as usual, pounding the gavel and reading a pre-written statement about the dangerous spread of misinformation. But Martin stood and respectfully interrupted. "This is a membership meeting," he said firmly, "and we have quorum." The room fell silent. He produced the petition. The lawyer, who had volunteered to represent the coalition, stood beside him and cited the section in the HOA bylaws that gave residents the right to vote out a board president with sufficient signatures and due process. Karen tried to object, saying the petition was tainted by lies, but the legal authority was already in place. The lawyer handed the documentation to the attending clerk. One by one, the names were verified. Then came the vote. Karen protested loudly, accused Martin of manipulating the neighborhood, shouted that he was orchestrating a coup, and warned that she'd sue everyone in the room. But no one flinched. One by one, hands were raised. When the final count was read aloud, an overwhelming majority in favor of removal, Karen dropped her pen and stared blankly at the table. Someone in the back clapped, then another, and another. The sound grew until it echoed off the walls of the clubhouse, drowning out the years of silence that had once gripped the neighborhood in fear. Karen was officially removed from the HOA board that night. She stood, red-faced and trembling, and hissed that they would regret this before storming out of the room. For a moment, everyone just stood there, stunned by the suddenness of it all. Then someone said, "What now?" And Martin answered, "Now we fix what she broke." The following day, the board was restructured. A new president was elected, someone who had once been fined $150 for leaving a cooler on her front porch for more than 1 hour. Committee positions were offered to volunteers. Transparency was the first rule voted into action. All meetings would be open, all budgets public, all decisions shared. But the cleanup had only just begun. Dozens of residents submitted requests for citation reviews. Some sought refunds, others simply wanted their records cleared. And then there was the legal side. What to do about the money Karen had spent? The private security cameras she'd installed with HOA funds, the side contracts she'd approved without a vote. Martin and the new board began digging deeper. They requested financial audits, subpoenaed vendor records, and cross-checked invoices. What they found was alarming. Over $18,000 in unexplained expenditures labeled community improvement, but with no corresponding project or receipt. Karen had funneled money into ghost services, and they now had proof. A formal complaint was filed with the county. Karen, now just a regular resident, received a letter from the HOA legal representative informing her she was under investigation. Her response came quickly, in the form of threats, cease and desist letters, claims of defamation, a new lawyer of her own. But the neighborhood didn't back down. This time, they were united, informed, and ready to defend themselves. And for the first time in years, Oak Hollow Estates wasn't afraid. Karen may have lost the presidency, but she hadn't lost her taste for control. And in the weeks following her removal, her behavior only grew more erratic, less composed, and far more aggressive from behind the scenes, like a puppet master desperate to keep her fingers on the strings even after the curtain had closed. Though she no longer had official authority, her house remained in the center of the neighborhood, her presence a constant reminder of the power she once wielded. She began walking her dog at specific times when she knew Julia would be outside tending to her garden, or when Martin was unloading groceries, stopping just long enough to make eye contact, just long enough to remind them she was still there. She started making passive-aggressive posts on the community message board under a new username, one that wasn't hard to trace, comments criticizing the directionless leadership of the new board, questioning their competence, warning that outsiders had no respect for Oak Hollow's values. Everyone knew it was her. But what disturbed people most was how she escalated her war using the legal system. Karen filed a lawsuit against the HOA board, naming Martin, Julia, and 3 others as individuals. The claim that she had been wrongfully removed, defamed, emotionally distressed, and targeted by a malicious smear campaign. The court documents, dripping with exaggeration, painted her as a victim of mob mentality, describing how her life had been irreparably damaged and how she feared walking in her own neighborhood. It was pure performance, no real evidence, no documentation, just carefully crafted legal fiction designed to drain their time, resources, and spirit. But Martin had expected something like this. He had a legal team ready, all working pro bono through a non-profit that defended homeowners against HOA abuse. They filed a countersuit backed by every shred of evidence they had collected over the past 3 months. Unauthorized spending, manufactured citations, board manipulation, and the systematic harassment of residents. The case gained traction. Local media, still watching closely after the viral news segment, picked up the story again. Ousted HOA president files lawsuit against residents, the headlines read, with side-by-side photos of Karen and Martin. Online opinion heavily favored the residents, and neighbors doubled down on their support. Some even crowdfunded legal expenses, raising more than enough to cover every anticipated filing fee. Karen, infuriated by her lack of control, began acting out in smaller but more disturbing ways. She sent complaint letters to the city inspector about code violations that didn't exist, peeling paint that wasn't peeling, illegal fencing that was actually within regulation. One family had a city vehicle show up unannounced to investigate a noise ordinance complaint for a toddler's birthday party that had ended 3 hours earlier. Every department that received a complaint quickly realized the pattern and quietly dismissed it, some even alerting the HOA about the obvious misuse of their hotlines. But Karen didn't stop. She hired a private investigator to monitor suspicious activity on her block, which really meant parking outside Martin's house at random hours, camera in hand, pretending to check for trespassers. Julia took photos of the car and sent them to the police. The officer who came recognized the PY and spoke to him directly. After that, the car didn't return. Meanwhile, the HOA audit results came back, and they were worse than anyone imagined. Not only had Karen misused funds for personal benefit, but several payments were traced to shell companies that didn't exist prior to her presidency and dissolved shortly after. A deeper investigation revealed that a landscaping contract for $6,000 had been funneled to a P.O. box linked to her cousin's name. The evidence was sent directly to the district attorney's office. Charges were drafted. Karen was subpoenaed for financial fraud and ordered to turn over her personal HOA communications and financial records. When she refused, a judge issued a compliance order. At the next hearing, her attorney requested a delay, citing mental health struggles caused by neighborhood bullying. But the judge didn't bite. The facts outweighed the fiction. Karen was now on the defensive in multiple arenas, criminal, civil, and reputational, and yet she still refused to accept that the community had moved on. Halloween decorations started going up in late October, the first time in years people felt safe enough to participate. Karen had once banned Halloween events, calling them disruptive and an invitation to mischief. But now, the entire street was lit with orange and purple. Front yards filled with fake ghosts, inflatable pumpkins, and smiling families taking photos together. Julia even hosted a cider stand for kids and neighbors. When Karen walked by, her dog yanking at the leash, no one spoke to her. She was no longer the HOA president. She was the ghost of a regime everyone wanted to forget. Martin, meanwhile, continued working with the new board to implement reforms. A public suggestion box was introduced. Quarterly budget reports were posted online. Monthly town halls were held with rotating moderators. For the first time, people felt heard. And for the first time, people began repairing relationships that Karen had quietly destroyed with her divisive tactics. One neighbor apologized to another for years of awkward silence. Another confessed they had once tattled out of fear of being reported themselves. It was slow, but real healing. Karen's trial date was set for January. Until then, she remained mostly inside, her house dark, the windows covered. She still posted online, still sent the occasional letter, but the neighborhood had learned how to ignore her. Power had shifted, and she couldn't unring that bell. But Martin wasn't naive. He knew people like Karen didn't disappear. They waited as the holiday season rolled in, and the neighborhood shimmered with decorations. For the first time in years, Oak Hollow Estates began to resemble the community it was always meant to be. Front porches glowing with lights, neighbors exchanging greetings and cookies, and kids running from yard to yard with mittens and laughter in place of anxiety. And while Karen's house remained cold, dark, and silent, no wreath, no lights, no visitors, her presence still lurked like a shadow at the edge of every gathering, every whispered conversation, every moment someone glanced across the street and remembered what they'd endured. The board continued implementing reforms, true transparency, fair enforcement, and actual democracy in neighborhood decisions. A resident-run holiday committee was formed, and Julia volunteered to lead it. She organized a winter celebration in the park with cocoa, fire pits, and even a visit from a local Santa actor. Over 200 people came, including families that had once avoided every community event out of fear. It felt like a rebirth. But just as things began settling into something peaceful, a cold letter arrived at Martin and Julia's home on a frosty December morning. It was from Karen's lawyer, a final desperate attempt before trial, a demand for settlement. She claimed the board had defamed her, ruined her reputation, and caused emotional distress. The amount requested, $250,000. Martin didn't even blink. He turned the letter over to the HOA's legal representative, who replied with a single page rejecting the offer and reaffirming their intent to continue both their defense and their countersuit. Karen's plan had been clear: file a frivolous claim, hope the fear of legal costs would break them, and walk away with cash. But it didn't work. Instead, the rejection was copied, redacted, and posted to the HOA bulletin board for all to see. The response from the neighborhood was immediate and furious. One neighbor, a retired contractor, offered to testify about how Karen had paid him cash from HOA funds without ever filing a permit for his work. Another neighbor, who had worked briefly as Karen's dog sitter years earlier, revealed that Karen used HOA money to buy pet supplies and bill them as community animal services. The case was unraveling faster than she could control it, and more people were stepping forward. But perhaps the most shocking moment came when Ellis, the former board member who had long avoided confrontation, showed up at Martin's house with a small black notebook, Karen's personal HOA ledger. He'd kept it hidden since the day she threatened him years ago, but finally decided to turn it over. Inside were handwritten notes, not just on citations and infractions, but about individual residents. Watch 4116, always has guests. 317 porch mat, replace next week. Man at 4209, military, arrogant. It was clear. Karen hadn't just enforced rules, she had surveilled, targeted, plotted. Martin sent the ledger to the HOA's attorney and the district attorney's office. Combined with the audit results and statements from current and former board members, the evidence painted a picture of a person who had used neighborhood leadership not to serve, but to dominate, punish, and control. The new board released a statement to the community acknowledging the investigation, affirming support for the legal process and thanking everyone who had come forward. It was signed unanimously. Karen, now under public scrutiny and legal pressure, filed one last desperate motion, requesting the case be moved out of county due to public bias. The judge denied it. The trial would proceed as scheduled. Through it all, Martin remained steady, though not unaffected. He'd seen plenty of courtroom drama in his years working on cases, but there was something deeply personal about this, how a quiet suburban neighborhood could become a battlefield through silence and misplaced trust. Julia tried to keep things light, focusing on the holidays, the garden, and helping neighbors plan for the spring HOA elections. But even she admitted, some nights, that the tension lingered. "She's like a ghost in our walls," she said once, sipping tea on the porch. "Not seen, not heard, but always there." And she was right. Even with everything stripped away, Karen still found ways to insert herself. She mailed flyers to a handful of homes, anonymous at first glance, but clearly her tone. Accusing the courthouse smelled of dust and old furniture, the kind of place where reputations went to die quietly under fluorescent lights. And as Martin sat beside his attorney at the long rectangular table, he watched Karen walk in, wearing a grey suit too tight in the shoulders and a pair of sunglasses she refused to remove even as she approached the bench, as though clinging to the last piece of authority she still believed she had. Her lawyer looked exhausted already, a man clearly hired more for appearance than strength, because the moment the judge requested opening arguments, it became painfully clear that Karen's case rested more on emotional language and vague claims than any real evidence. Her team presented her as a dedicated public servant, a woman vilified for enforcing rules too well, misunderstood by a group of disgruntled neighbors who resented authority. They used words like respectability, tradition, and order, but each time they tried to cite a violation of process, Martin's legal team countered with receipts, policies, timelines, and testimony. Over the course of 3 days, witness after witness took the stand. The Burkes, the elderly couple fined for hanging patriotic banners. Angela, a mother of 2, who'd been cited 4 times for sidewalk chalk drawings. Even Kevin, the quiet army vet, told the court how Karen used neighborhood rules like weapons, how she'd patrolled at night with a flashlight, peering into windows, measuring grass, even photographing license plates. The judge didn't show expression often, but by the second day, it was clear her patience for Karen's posturing had worn thin. Karen herself took the stand, and what unfolded was not a defense, but a showcase of denial and delusion. She insisted she had never overstepped her authority, that every citation was justified, and that any appearance of bias was coincidental. When asked about the private ledger, her handwritten notes on residence, she claimed it was just a draft tool, nothing official. The courtroom went silent when Martin's lawyer held up the notebook and read aloud a line. 317 has guests again. Report as suspected rental. The judge leaned forward. Did you act on that note, Ms. Grayson? Karen hesitated, then said, I may have mentioned it to the board. But the board was already gone, dismantled and replaced, and 2 of its former members had already testified that Karen ran every decision through fear. Then came the financial audit, a spreadsheet projected on a monitor for everyone to see. Line by line, unauthorized payments were shown. $4,800 for community surveillance upgrades that were installed only on Karen's home, $6,200 for vendor services with no matching invoices, $2,700 for event catering that had never occurred. The DA's investigator, calm and methodical, explained how each payment violated HOA protocols and in some cases broke civil statutes. Karen's attorney objected, citing irrelevance to the emotional damages claim, but the judge overruled it. Pattern of behavior is relevant here, she said, especially when assessing the credibility of the plaintiff. And in that moment, it was clear. Karen's story was crumbling. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Julia didn't attend every day. She preferred to stay with the neighbors, helping answer questions and keep spirits high. But she came on the final morning of testimony. She sat quietly in the second row, watching as Karen's composure cracked. At one point, when a resident mentioned how Karen had threatened to call immigration on a landscaper she didn't recognize, Julia saw Karen's hands grip the witness stand so tightly her knuckles turned white. The final blow came when Ellis, the former board member, testified. He read directly from an email Karen had sent him years earlier, telling him to fall in line or step aside. It was short, unambiguous, and signed with her full name. The courtroom absorbed every word. Karen stared at the floor. That afternoon, the judge recessed and set the date for a ruling. 3 weeks from then, no jury, just the law. But no one in Oak Hollow needed to wait for the verdict to know they had already won. Karen left through the side exit, sunglasses back on, her head low. A few reporters called her name, but she said nothing. She never returned to the clubhouse, never spoke on the community app again. And though her lawsuit hadn't been formally dismissed yet, her threats had stopped. Residents began to celebrate, not loudly, but meaningfully. Martin received cards. Julia received flowers. Their front lawn became a symbol of resistance. Decorated, bright, full of warmth. Kids played there without fear. An old man dropped off a handmade bench with a note that read, "For the porch that protected us all." At night, Martin and Julia would sit together and watch the quiet street. No more suspicious cars, no more random citations, just neighbors talking, walking, living. One evening, Kevin walked up and said, "You did what we couldn't." But Martin just shook his head. "We did it together." By the time the official ruling arrived in late January, Oak Hollow Estates had already moved on, like a forest that had finally regrown after a slow-burning fire. But still, the neighborhood held its breath as Martin unfolded the final court decision at the evening town hall, the same clubhouse that Karen had once ruled like a courtroom of her own, now filled with neighbors sitting shoulder to shoulder in quiet anticipation. The verdict was unambiguous. The court found that Karen Grayson had abused her authority as HOA president, violated fiduciary duties, engaged in harassment through misuse of citations, and falsified records to maintain control. Her lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she could never file it again, and she was ordered to pay restitution for the misused HOA funds as well as legal fees incurred by the board in defending against her claims. There was no celebration in the form of fireworks or loud cheers, just a long round of applause, respectful, emotional, and deeply satisfied. The community hadn't just survived Karen. It had proven in court that her actions weren't just unethical, they were unlawful. Karen's property, once the most perfectly manicured in the neighborhood, now sat in visible decline. Her lawn was overgrown, The mailbox leaned to one side, and the HOA's new landscaping contractor had already flagged her for violations she would now have to answer for, like everyone else. She no longer showed her face outside. The curtains never moved. A for sale sign went up not long after, and though a few interested buyers toured the home, word had already spread, and no one wanted to move into the house of the woman who made national news for trying to micromanage an entire community into submission. Eventually, the house sat empty. When she finally moved out, it was in the middle of the night, a moving van pulling away without anyone noticing until the next morning. Julia stood at the kitchen window, watching the driveway across the street, her mug warm in her hands. "She's really gone," she said quietly. Martin didn't answer. He simply placed the court document back in the drawer, alongside all the evidence, letters, and statements they'd gathered over the past year. The file was labeled Oak Hollow, Resolved, and he hoped it would never need to be opened again. But the community hadn't forgotten what they'd been through, and they didn't want to. They wanted to remember, not for bitterness, but as a warning. That spring, the HOA hosted its first public exhibition, a timeline of neighborhood recovery. It included photos of violation notices, a copy of the judge's ruling, statements from residents, and even excerpts from the financial audit. It was called From Fear to Freedom, and it wasn't just for Oak Hollow. Other HOAs sent representatives. Reporters showed up again. Podcasts invited Martin and Julia to speak. They declined most offers, preferring to stay local to focus on rebuilding rather than retelling. But they gave one interview to the same local news channel that had first covered the story. Sitting side by side on their porch, they spoke about community, courage, and the quiet danger of unchecked authority. Martin said, "We never moved here to fight. We moved here to live. But when you're pushed, you either give in or push back. We pushed back." The clip went viral. Thousands of comments flooded in from people living under similar pressures. "This is happening in my neighborhood right now," one wrote. "Wish we had someone like Martin." But Martin didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted to mow his lawn in peace, and he finally could. The new board operated with complete transparency. Elections were competitive. Rules were rewritten with community input. There were no secret meetings, no surprise fines, no clipboard patrols. And more importantly, there was trust, slowly built, carefully preserved, and deeply valued. Julia continued leading the community beautification team. The spring garden tour was reinstated. Children's playdays returned to the park. Neighbors who once avoided each other now shared meals, carpooled, and even swapped lawn equipment. A sense of unity had emerged, not because they all agreed, but because they had fought something greater together and won. And yet, despite all this progress, one quiet day reminded them just how fragile peace could be. A single letter arrived in Martin and Julia's mailbox, with no return address. Inside was a photograph of their house, taken from a distance, with a typed note that read, "You're not the hero you think you are." Martin stared at it for a long moment. He didn't speak. He simply put the letter in a file marked Post Karen, made a copy, and handed it to the police. He didn't panic. He didn't raise the alarm. He just added it to the record, because he knew what Karen never did. Power rooted in fear always leaves residue. The anonymous photo and message might have rattled someone else, but for Martin, it served only as confirmation that the echoes of Karen's regime were still fading rather than gone. the final sputter of a fire that had once raged unchecked through every inch of Oak Hollow's streets. He didn't tell Julia right away. There was no need to burden her with something that held no power anymore. But he did install one more outdoor security camera, pointed discreetly toward the sidewalk, not because he expected retaliation, but because vigilance, once earned, never really left a man like him. Still, life moved on, as it always does when people are finally allowed to breathe freely. The house that Karen once occupied was purchased by a young couple from out of town, a pair of newlyweds with a golden retriever, and no idea what the property had once represented. They repainted the shutters, replaced the brittle grass with fresh sod, and even waved excitedly to every passerby as if trying to wash the history off the bricks with kindness. Most of the neighborhood welcomed them quickly, grateful to start fresh, but a few long-time residents hesitated, unsure how to reconcile the physical structure with the weight it carried in memory. Julia, ever the diplomat, brought over a basket of fresh-baked muffins, introduced herself with a smile, and never once mentioned the name Karen. It was a symbolic moment, the very woman who had once been targeted, fined, and threatened, now extending an open hand to the ones inheriting the wreckage. As the seasons changed and spring blossomed across the lawns, Oak Hollow found its rhythm again. For the first time in years, the community organized a full-scale block party with food trucks, live music, and even a bouncy castle. The event was packed. Families that had once stayed behind closed doors now danced under string lights, laughed over grilled burgers, and let their children roam from yard to yard without fear of complaint letters or prying eyes. Martin stood at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, quietly observing it all with the same calm demeanor that had carried him through every stage of the HOA battle. Julia leaned in and whispered, "It's like none of it ever happened." But Martin shook his head. "No," he said. "It's better because it did." That sentiment was shared by many. The story of Oak Hollow had traveled far. HOA reform advocates referenced it during conferences. Legal panels cited the case when discussing abuse of non-profit authority. And while Martin declined every invitation to become some kind of activist or public figure, he always responded to the letters sent by people trapped in similar situations, handwritten notes from folks across the country who felt voiceless in the face of power-drunk HOA leaders, begging for advice, for a strategy, for hope. He responded the same way every time. Document everything, build alliances, never fight alone. One such letter came from a man in Florida whose HOA president had installed private security guards who patrolled with flashlights and threatened children riding scooters. Martin sent him a copy of the legal template they used in Oak Hollow and encouraged him to find his own version of Julia, a partner who could organize the social front while he handled the paperwork. "This battle," he wrote, "is one with both compassion and calculation." That was the lesson Karen never understood. She thought fear alone could hold a neighborhood together. She didn't realize that community grows strongest when people are free to make mistakes, share meals, argue, forgive, and help one another without the constant threat of punishment. Even the neighbors who had once stood silently during Karen's reign were now active participants in rebuilding. One older man who had avoided every HOA meeting for 5 years volunteered to run the new Welcome Committee. A woman who had once anonymously reported her neighbor for a missing garbage lid now co-managed the community garden with him. Small things, perhaps, but each was a piece of healing, of repair. Still, not everything was completely smooth. There were disagreements over landscaping rules, mailbox design, and whether Halloween decorations should be permitted before October 1st. But now, those debates happened out in the open, settled by vote, shaped by discussion, and accepted by all. And no matter how minor the topic, everyone took it seriously, because they remembered what it was like when one voice dictated everything. The memory of Karen lingered, not in fear, but as a cautionary tale. A story parents told to new homeowners, a whisper during board elections, remember what happened last time. The new HOA president, elected with overwhelming support, made it her mission to maintain that openness. She held office hours twice a month on her porch. Every budget line item was emailed to residents before approval. And perhaps most importantly, she created a rotating audit committee made up of randomly.
By the time summer rolled around and the heat settled into the sidewalks like a second layer of concrete, Oak Hollow was more alive than it had been in years. With neighbors hosting cookouts on weeknights, teenagers offering to mow lawns for the elderly without expecting payment, and the neighborhood bulletin board covered in flyers for things like book clubs, pet adoption events, and free piano lessons. Yet even amid the buzz of new life, the story of what had happened with Karen remained close to the surface, not as gossip, but as a shared understanding that the peace they now enjoyed hadn't come cheaply. At a July 4th community meeting, held under the shade of the park pavilion, Martin was asked to say a few words. He stood slowly, hands in his pockets, and looked out at the crowd, parents holding toddlers, veterans wearing ball caps, young couples still learning the rhythms of the community. He didn't speak long, just said, "We stood up when it mattered, and that's all anyone can ask of a good neighbor." That one sentence was met with nods, a few quiet claps, and then the moment passed, not grandstanding, just gratitude. But while the HOA meetings grew increasingly uneventful, the distant shadow of Karen was never completely forgotten. One day a neighbor received a strange call from someone claiming to be from a law firm conducting a survey on HOA dissolution procedures. The language was vague, but it rang familiar. Number traced back to a private law office in a nearby city, one that had previously represented Karen during her attempt to overturn the court's decision. When the board received that report, they forwarded it immediately to their legal advisor, who confirmed it was most likely a fishing expedition. Nothing ever came of it, but the attempt was a reminder. Some people, even in defeat, never truly let go of their obsession with power. Meanwhile, Martin and Julia continued living the life they had moved here to build. On weekends, they went hiking in the nearby state park. Julia had expanded her backyard garden and started donating fresh produce to a local food pantry. Martin took up woodworking again, building benches and birdhouses for neighbors who asked, always refusing payment, always giving quietly. Despite everything they had been through, they were not bitter. If anything, they had become more invested in the idea of community, of what it meant to not just live somewhere, but to belong. That spirit began to spread. The new HOA board passed a motion to remove punitive fines for first-time violations, replacing them with written notices and optional assistance. Instead of a threat, the letter now read, "How can we help you bring your property up to community standards?" For some, that meant the difference between shame and dignity. One woman cried when a group of neighbors helped repaint her fence after she received a notice. It wasn't punishment. It was kindness. And that shift away from fear and into mutual support became the legacy that quietly replaced Karen's years of rule. But Karen herself hadn't vanished completely, though her house had sold and she was never seen in Oak Hollow again. Rumors surfaced from a neighboring HOA that a woman named Carrie Gray had applied for a board position. The name was suspiciously similar, and though no one could prove, it was her. A few HOA reform forums online began warning communities to look out for HOA refugees. With a history of abuse in other neighborhoods, Martin didn't respond publicly, but he followed the stories, made notes, and occasionally sent anonymous tips to forum admins when certain patterns emerged. not to punish, but to prevent. Back in Oak Hollow, a local high school student working on a civics project asked to interview Martin and Julia about their experience. Julia smiled and said she'd be happy to, but only if it wasn't just about the drama. "Talk about how we rebuilt," she said, "not just how it broke." Interview became a feature in the school's community newsletter, and the teachers shared it with other schools in the district. Eventually, a local university asked permission to include the case in a course on urban planning and civic engagement. The students didn't focus on Karen. They focused on the recovery, on how a neighborhood changed its structure, rewrote its bylaws, healed its divisions, and returned power to the people who actually lived there. That, more than any lawsuit or court verdict, was what mattered to Martin. He often said to Julia, "The real win isn't that we stopped her. We made sure there won't be another her." And as summer faded into early autumn, and the leaves began to curl and drop from the trees along the neighborhood's walking paths, Oak Hollow began preparing for its next election cycle. Multiple candidates stepped forward. Flyers were handed out, not with promises of order and control, but with plans for improvement and inclusion. The forums weren't contentious. They were thoughtful, civil, hopeful. And when the time came to vote, participation hit an all-time high. Over 90% of households cast a ballot. The winning candidate was a retired school principal who had once received a $75 citation from Karen for having unauthorized backyard decorations during a family reunion. Her first act as president was to abolish the citation policy entirely and replace it with a volunteer compliance walk neighbors. Helping neighbors. No fines. Just conversation. Just trust. By the time the leaves had fully changed and the fall breeze carried the scent of chimney smoke and fresh earth through Oak Hollow estates, the neighborhood had become something rare, not just functional, but genuinely connected. People didn't just wave at each other anymore. They stopped to talk, to ask questions, to offer help before it was requested. The neighborhood Facebook group, once a tool of silent surveillance and petty accusations, was now filled with shared recipes, school, fundraiser announcements, lost and found posts, and birthday shoutouts. The scars from Karen's era hadn't vanished entirely. There were still moments. When a sudden knock on the door or an official-looking envelope triggered a flash of old fear in some, but those moments were fewer. And they were met not with isolation, but with collective support. No one was afraid to ask for help anymore. Julia continued coordinating seasonal events. That year's fall festival broke all attendance records, complete with hayrides, pie contests, and even a neighborhood talent show. Martin built the stage for it himself using reclaimed wood. From a neighbor's remodel project, kids ran freely through leaf piles. Older residents laughed with one another under the golden trees. And for the first time, the festival ended not with a sense of obligation, but with joy. That joy, simple as it was, felt revolutionary for a community that had once lived under quiet oppression. The new board functioned like a true representative body, residents rotating in and out of leadership roles with no power plays, no politics, just people doing their part and moving on. When disputes arose, they were handled with conversation instead of citations. When homes needed maintenance, neighbors offered to pitch in instead of report violations. Martin and Julia often joked that the HOA had become more human than ever, and that was the truth of it. Even newcomers who had no knowledge of Karen's legacy quickly adapted to the culture of kindness and responsibility. No one wanted to bring back the old ways. But despite the calm, Martin never forgot the lesson that had been carved into every step of their journey, that unchecked power can grow quietly, that fear feeds it, and that courage, however small at first, is what ultimately starves it. So he kept his file cabinet organized, his records intact, and every year he offered to mentor any resident interested in joining the board, not for control, but for continuity. He knew better than anyone that communities didn't stay safe. By accident, they stayed safe because people paid attention. Years passed. The house once ruled by Karen was now filled with the sounds of a new family, children playing in the backyard, parents laughing on the porch, the occasional birthday party spilling onto the front lawn. The new owners never asked about the homes. Passed, and no one volunteered it. History, after all, didn't need to be a burden. It could simply be a lesson passed on when necessary. On the 5th anniversary of Karen's removal, the HOA held a symbolic vote, a resolution titled "The Neighborhood We Choose to Be." It passed unanimously. Martin and Julia didn't attend the meeting that day. They were out of town visiting family. But when they returned, their mailbox was filled with thank you notes. Some from neighbors. Some from strangers who had followed their story online and used it to stand up in their own communities. One note read, "Because of you, I didn't sell my house, I stayed. I fought back. And now we're rebuilding too," Julia cried, reading it. Martin just nodded and said, "That's all we ever wanted." They had never asked to be heroes. They had just refused to be silent. And in doing so, they had changed not only Oak Hollow, but helped light a path for others who thought they were alone. So if you've ever been bullied by power, if you've ever watched someone turn a neighborhood into a kingdom and wondered if you could do something about it, you remember this: you're not alone. There are others just like you, and together you can make your community stronger. If this story moved you, inspired you, reminded you that courage starts with one person saying enough, then don't just watch, act. And make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories on YouTube. We bring you the real, raw neighborhood battles that others try to silence. Subscribe now and be part of a growing community that refuses to back down from the truth, because sometimes the quietest streets hide the loudest fights. Join us and let's tell them all together.